You turn the page, just to the very next page, you'll see another vignette about a young Chinese young man who was from a moderately wealthy family. He was the oldest son of his father, and he had dreams that he was going to go to a university in Europe and learn chemistry, and then come back and help to industrialize his country. He had big plans for himself and for his country, but his father called him into his bedside one day and said, "Son, I realize I'm dying. The doctors can't pull me through, and I'm going to turn my estate over to you." By the way, this young man had picked out a girl he wanted to marry. But his father said to him, "Son, I have arranged a marriage for you, and you're going to take over my land starting today. I'm too weak and too feeble." The young man just went out of his father's room. He did not try to rebel, did not argue. He just broke down and sobbed for some time, because number one, he was not going to get to marry the girl he wanted. Number two, he was not going to have the career he wanted. And he was trapped. But again, he was bound by tradition. But, folks, this was the beginning. Within a few generations, Chinese men were able to say to their daddies, "I'm going to be my own man. I'm going to go my own way." That was to come a little bit later. But in this generation, they had the dream, which this young man was not able to fulfill. Again, this college attracts a whole lot of Chinese students, and no one can predict what kind of changes they will make when they go back to China, having seen America. Maybe some things about America they do not like, maybe some things they do. All right. Japan. The Japanese had been on the western side, the same side of the United States in World War I, largely because they wanted to drive out German influence from the region. Now, in this period of time between the wars, Japan was experiencing a big population boom. And folks, this is what gets confusing about history. Fast forward to 3 generations, and Japanese people are dying because they're not producing children. But that's today. But at this time, they had a large population boom. Japan was really fast transforming itself into an industrial society. They had already begun the process, but they were even accelerating it now. They were on the winning side of World War I, and yes, German influence had been driven out of the Far East at the end of World War I. Japan had a dream. Their dream was that they would take over all the lands of the Far East. They called it the land of the rising sun, where they'd become the empire of the rising sun. And they said when the sun comes up, and if you know anything about the globe of the world, the international date line is located just east of Japan. The Japanese said, when the sun comes up to dawn a new day, it'll first shine on the Eastern Empire, where the sun rises, and all of this part of the world will be under the control of Japan. They had dreams of taking over Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and China. And they were going to force these countries to, they said, give us our raw materials, and we would transform them into finished products, and you will buy our finished products. Now, there were several things that stood away in the dream. Number one, the United States had the Philippines. Number two, the Dutch had Indonesia. Number three, the French had Vietnam. Number four, the British had Hong Kong and some influence in China. And then, of course, there was Russia there, who was determined to know that the Russians' eastern border was right there close to Japan, and they said, no, you're not going to have it. But the Japanese had this dream that they could conquer the eastern part of the world and rule it themselves. It was somewhat of an illusion. They really did not have the means to conquer the whole eastern part of the world. But nevertheless, that was their dream, and they dreamed that they would be on the top of that part of the world. And the eastern part of the world would, you might say, bow down to them. And the rest of the eastern part of the world would become their colony. Your book mentions, I must mention this, if you look on the top of page 717, I mean, when I first saw this, I thought, hey, I didn't know this chapter was about a war. No, it looks like a big, big bomb has been dropped on Tokyo. The fact is, that's just the result of an earthquake. Now, Japan last had an earthquake 3 years ago this month, I believe. During the last earthquake in 2011, the people had about a 30-second warning. An alarm went off in the tall buildings, and that way some of them at least knew to either get out or take cover. But in the 1923 earthquake in Tokyo, there were no warnings, no way to predict earthquakes, and the people were caught flat-footed and they died by the tens of thousands. And again, you can see why. Bricks falling, blocks falling on top of them. The Japanese have proven time and time again they're resilient. They rebuilt their city, only to have it largely destroyed again during World War II. Again by American bombers. But they had a huge earthquake in 1923. Japan is sitting on some islands that are a little bit unstable. And the islands, they're also sitting on a fault line. If you know anything about the Earth's geography, or there's tectonic plates that rub, and sometimes one of these plates will move, and when the plate moves, there's an earthquake results. Now, I was in Guatemala one time, and it was like the road did this. The road was going along here, and all of a sudden, the road resumed right here. And again, it was obvious that what had happened was that the earth had shifted from here to here, sometime before I got there. Shifted about 3 or 4 feet over from where it had been. Again, if you're located along a fault line, you can expect to feel an earthquake from time to time. The state of Georgia is not located right on a fault line, even though from time to time we do have earthquakes. Had one, 2 or 3 weeks ago. I never felt it. Again, the last 2 earthquakes we've had, I've had the privilege of being in my car and haven't felt a thing. But anyway, we haven't had a bad one here in quite a long time. The early 1800s, from what I've been told. Now, in the case of Japan, they had a power struggle. Now, I've mentioned how that Japan is the one country that has never changed families of emperors for about 2,600 years. The present emperor can trace his dynasty all the way back to about 600 BC. Half of your emperors, though, have been mere figureheads, just like the present one is. So the power struggles occurred, but always leaving the emperor out of it. He would be the figurehead ruler, no matter which side he wanted. But there was a power struggle between the militants on the one hand and the democracies on the other. But then came the Great Depression of 1929. And a lot of the Japanese lost faith in democracies, as was the case with Germany, and the case with Italy, and the case with Spain, and a lot of the Latin American countries too. I mean, democracy began to fail all over the place, and Japan was no exception. The militants took over Japan. Eventually, a leader came along named Tojo. We don't hear much about him anymore, but he was a Japanese leader, and he got together a group of people they called the warlords, and they began to centralize Japanese authority and centralize Japanese power, and build up armaments and prepare their country for a big war, which it did come. The Japanese were upset because in Washington, D.C., in 1921, I believe, there had been a peace conference. And this peace conference said, let's make sure that we arm ourselves in such a way that there'll be no more wars. Making nations, so they said the United States should have a ratio of 5 warships, 5 tanks, 5 planes. Britain got 5, France got 5, Japan only got 3. And the Japanese felt, hey, what makes us so inferior to the United States, Britain, and France? And eventually they broke the agreement. They were there at the agreement, and they initially signed to keep it, but they broke it, even as did Adolf Hitler. Adolf, by the way, Germany was to get nothing. Germany's army was, by the Treaty of Versailles, was greatly limited. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about how Adolf Hitler broke the treaty and armed Germany in spite. But they tried to practice disarmament. They hoped by doing this it would help guarantee the peace. All right. moving away from Japan, I think all of you know where we're going now. Yes?
Which treaty? What?
It was a treaty, let's see, the
What
book
year?
mentions it. It occurred in Washington now. Washington, let's see, convened, I'm looking at the bottom page 717, in 1922, that was a date, in Washington, D.C., the United States convened a major conference of national interest to discuss, that's not exactly where it happened, but it was a treaty that occurred right about that time, but okay, I'm sorry, it wasn't this one. They were trying to deal with China and Japan. Okay, but it's not in the book. I tell you what, then forget about it. It's not in the book. It's something that I was taught when I was younger. That the Japanese felt humiliated. Another thing too that upset the Japanese, again, is not in the book. The United States began to practice immigration policies that restricted Japanese from coming to the United States. Some of you have heard about this already. China, the United States did not want any more Orientals, and they greatly reduced Chinese, particularly Chinese more than Japanese, but told the Chinese and Japanese they were not welcome to come here anymore. And this angered both countries, China and Japan. The Chinese and Americans, the Japanese and Americans would become highly suspicious of each other, and this suspicion was eventually to lead to war. All right. Latin America. The Latin Americans had a difficult time forming a democracy. And you want to say something?
I was seeing if you had the second roll yet.
Oh, I'll make sure you get counted present. I did take roll, but I'll make sure you get. I took roll when I passed out the test. All right. Latin America, but they tended to revert to dictatorship. Now, Latin America did not change a lot, at least in several regards, during this period. Now, what I'm saying does not apply to the year 2014 as much. But they had a society where the rich were extremely rich, very, very rich, and everybody else was extremely poor, with hardly anybody in the middle. You were either very rich, and only about 1 out of 400 people were, and then the other 399 out of 400 were extremely poor. And this was to remain true throughout Latin America. The church was very heavily involved in Latin American politics. They could not separate church from state. And again, this does not apply necessarily to 2014. They would go from one dictatorship to another. Some dictators lasted till the day they died. Some dictators only lasted till the day that someone else took over. But essentially, they would try a dictatorship, and each dictator would promise them, we'll have democracy as soon as I decide you're ready for it. But you people are not yet ready for democracy like the United States has. And speaking of the United States, they looked on the United States as being that big colossus of the North, that big country of the North that often interferes in our affairs. The United States would sometimes send troops into Latin America. And in my lifetime, I've seen this happen. President Johnson sent troops into Haiti one time. Ronald Reagan went to Panama and captured Manuel Noriega, and he's still in American jail in Florida. The charge was drug trafficking, which probably Noriega was guilty of. He was tried for it and found guilty. But the United States went into Panama during Reagan's term. Ronald Reagan also went into Grenada and bought some kind of order on the island of Grenada. President Theodore Roosevelt had a policy of speak softly but carry a big stick. In other words, when you have to, be firm with them. And he applied this to Latin America more than anyone else. They wound up making a lot of Latin Americans hate us.